Well, good evening. When I was a kid, I was taught the preamble to the Constitution in a very kind of like just a rhythmic way. It was kind of, we, the people of the United States, and you had to do these snaps in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, to ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Now, you may be here tonight and you're kind of wondering, why are we talking about the preamble of the Constitution in the midst of this conversation? But in the midst of that preamble, there are some values that are represented by the people who started this country and created this Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, a perfect unity amongst its citizens. In order to form a more perfect unity, establish justice. We want to see justice. It's this safety that's there. Ensure domestic tranquility. This is peace, and it's a calmness that exists in the midst of who we are. Ensure domestic tranquility. Provide for the common defense. This is also a safety aspect in seeing those things in our community. Promote the general welfare, promoting the well-being of all the people who are involved in the United States. Promote the general welfare. And secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves. The blessings of liberty, this idea of freedom, basic rights to ourselves and our posterity, our future generations, our children. And I think in the midst of this conversation that we're talking about today, those are the values that we want to bring in to this conversation. The peace and the liberty, the justice, all of those kinds of things. And we know that in a country like this, when we don't have those things, when we find those things not lining up, we find ourselves in conflict. And that's where we start, to some extent, our conversation today, this perceived conflict between law enforcement and community. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And so we want to welcome you to Bridge. And the whole reason we created this night is because we wanted to try to bring together the community and law enforcement. And some people say that the bridge between them is a very rickety bridge. It's an unstable bridge. Or some will say that the bridge has these holes in it. Or some will say that there is no bridge between these two things. And so tonight we're going to talk about that. And we're going to look at those things. And we're going to examine that bridge a little bit more. And if it is unstable, then we're going to try to throw some reinforcements in there. And if it is piecemealed, if it doesn't have some pieces missing, we're going to try to fill in those gaps tonight. And if indeed there is no bridge between, then we're going to start building the construction for that. And that's kind of the purpose of tonight, really to create this bridge between two sides. But the key with that is that you have to have two sides at the table. A bridge is not a bridge if it's just one side. And so we're going to be looking at that, and we want this to be a very fair and open conversation to just begin some thinking and some problem solving to what we can do to further and strengthen the relationship between the community and law enforcement. My name is Marcus Lloyd, and I'll be your moderator tonight, the ones kind of asking the questions. It's going to be a great, fun night, I think. I want you guys to take part in it. And if you look in your handout that you were given, you'll see that you have, at the very bottom of this handout, there is a website here. It's called elevateministry.net/question. And so that's how we're going to be taking questions tonight. There's no open mic, as you can see. And so if you want to get on your tablet, if you want to get your cell phone, if you brought your computer, and just submit those questions, then I'll have them here on my trusty computer, and we'll be able to kind of have those things to make sure that you are heard and a part of this conversation as well. Before we get started, I want to thank First Baptist Church McKinney for allowing us to come into this beautiful venue. I want to thank Elevate for hosting this and creating this, the young adults that have come together to make this thing happen. I want to thank the City of McKinney for loaning us the chief for the night, so thank you for that, City of McKinney, and also the City of Plano for the assistant chief we have here as well. This is a great collaboration of different people coming together to make sure that this happens. Remember, you can always put in your questions with the site that I've given you. I want to make some introductions, let you know who we have on the panel. First, and I've already alluded to the fact that he's here. This is the Chief of McKinney, Greg Connolly. So we're so glad that you're here, Chief. You guys can give him a hand for being here. been the chief of McKinney now since April, right? April of 2015?
Yeah, I have 6 months.
6 months, all right. Well, you are a seasoned pro at being a chief, but we know that you also had some time in Garland as an assistant chief down there, so we're glad that you're here. And next to him, we have the assistant chief, one of the assistant chiefs in Plano, and this is Ed Drain. So give him a hand for coming and being with us. Assistant chief has been in the department since 1994, I think is what I read, and but has been the assistant chief since 2006. And we had a great conversation talking about his background in the Army and dealing with explosives and things. So that's always an interesting conversation to find out why people want to get involved in explosives. Next to Chief Drain, we have Michael Rose, who is a Collin College professor. Thank you so much for being here. He teaches psychology over there, but also head of the math and sociology department, got his BS in criminology, and then also was a correction officer in Texas for some time as well. So thank you so much for being here too, Michael. Next to Michael, we have Alonzo Tutson. Did I say that right, Alonzo?
Correct.
Wonderful, good. He's a community advocate here, works with lots of different organizations, NAACP, Youth, the Christian Men of Vision and Principle, McKinney Housing Authority, so it'll be great to have your insight into this conversation. Thanks for being here. And then all the way to the end, this is Antoine Malone, and he is one of the youth, young adult mobilizers here. Works as one of the ministry directors for Elevate, which is the organization that's putting this on, one of the organizers and the envisioners of this night altogether. So thank you guys so much for being here and taking part in this. I know you have lots of other things to do, but we're glad that you're going to take part in this conversation. I think it'll be a lot of fun. Like I said, if you want to put in your questions, make sure you just go to that elevateministry.net/question. Bathrooms and things are outside if you need to make your way out there. But we're glad to have you, so we're just going to jump right in if you guys are ready to go into it. And tonight what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of throw some questions to different people. I'll throw it to everybody as a whole. I'll also be looking at questions online as well to be kind of intermixing some of those things in just to make sure we get some of that out. But first question, this kind of goes for all of you in this. Over the past year in America, we seem to be consistently exposed to video footage of conflict between law enforcement and the community. And these videos have produced very polarized responses and reactions. And I was listening to Tony Brinker Pickens, who is the founder of Operation Blue Shield, and she called this the erosion of trust. She says, when trust dies, mistrust flourishes. So my question to you, is there a problem of trust between law enforcement and the community? This is the fun part to see who jumps in first.
Thinking police chief?
Certainly, I'm going to look at it from the police perspective.
Sure.
And I think that that's true to some extent. I don't know if it's, when we can say if there's an erosion, it's really hard for me to evaluate. I just think that there is something there that we need to deal with. It's hard for me to look back and say, is it something that's developed in our society over time, or is it just now something that's being exposed to a greater extent? I was talking with one of my co-panelists earlier today, talking about the rapid changes in our society and many of the social changes, the things that our young people are experiencing. It's very different that if I talk to somebody from my generation, regardless of their race, as to when I talk to young people. And I think their perspectives are very different. And it's important that we as a profession, as far as from the police perspective, hear what they have to say and connect with them.
Any others?
Marcus, my comments on that would be that certainly there is an erosion of trust in certain communities. I think if you go to Ferguson, I think if you ask the people in Baltimore, if you ask the people in certain segments of the community in New York City, South Carolina, other places, but just like with teachers or with pastors or ministers, sometimes they mess up, and we have to be careful on saying that applies across the board, because some people may have a problem with churches or religion that everyone sees them as being bad. And I think that's the same thing in law enforcement. So it's going to depend on the community that you're in, I think. In some places, the police and law enforcement they get great support from their community, but certainly that is not across the board. So I think it's going to be kind of geographically based is going to be the biggest factor leading to that. And I think another factor leading to that too is I don't know that that law enforcement are having these confrontational issues any more so than they have in the past, maybe less, maybe more, but we have a lot more social media today that's getting that word out. I think the situation in Ferguson really wasn't initiated by media, as some people have claimed. It was really a social media phenomenon that started over Twitter and Facebook and some other social media outlets that really got that kicked off. So I think things today can get out so rapidly that it can make it appear as if things are worse now than they were, say, 10 years ago, when I don't know if that's the case.
Alonzo, how would you you've been in McKinney on the east side for a long time doing some work over there, so how would you describe that? Would you say there's an erosion of trust between the community and the
Well, the erosion of trust depends on perspective.
Okay.
The best analogy I can give is that of being in a boat or in a ship. Now, things are fine if you're on the deck playing shuffleboard, but if you're in the belly of the ship shoveling coal to keep the ship going, then your perspective is totally different. So I can speak from just living in the community here on the east side from that perspective. When our first encounter with the police department is usually negative. I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, so just hold your hands up in your heart if you're with me. So that tends to leave a bad taste in the community's mouth when your first encounter or interaction with the police department is negative. So I would say, yes, there is definitely an erosion of trust. But I can say it on both ends as well. So.
Now, Antoine, Chief Connolly mentioned this idea of generations, you know, talking to people who are, I guess, more in the Chief's generation and how they feel about it would differ from those in the younger version. Do you see anything that to make that case in the young adults?
I think that we're in a generation where emotion is a high driver of reality, and I think that's the reason that social media gets as much traction as it does, is because it taps into an emotional piece of an event, and it dictates, it tells you how you should feel, and asks you to continue to feel that. It affirms that. And I think what has happened, I think it's a mix of what, I believe we're in a place where it's a little bit of what everyone has said, that there is legitimate mistrust, but there's also this sort of spreading of that information that allows incomplete pictures to create emotional responses that go far beyond the way where they should. And now we're in a generation where emotion is heavy, and emotion is what drives us, and in many cases, and it makes it really difficult to get to real, true issues and find out what really is.
Hello? Oh, to kind of take off of that, and also what the chief said just a second ago, one of the difficulties that we have is that what we see is what we believe is happening all the time, and we look at the news, and we see this highly emotional footage all the time, and it makes us feel that that's the case 100% all the time, and it may be, depending on where you are, your community or anything, but it very well, it's unlikely that that's the case all the time. Well, we don't see the cases where the police officers are doing a really good job, they're going in the community, they're helping. Those aren't the ones we're catching on our iPhones, and so we're putting it on our iPhones, we're putting it in the media, and people are more likely, an example is, most people are scared to death of flying because they see all the plane crashes and everything on the news, and they don't realize that you're much more likely to die on the highway than you are in a plane, but nonetheless, I was kind of putting up on that.
You know, you guys are bringing up something that I know. President Obama, in describing Ferguson and Baltimore, said that this type of police and community interaction was not new, but that it's been going on a long time. So I want to get just a sense from you guys. Do we believe that this is isolated incidents of conflict, or is there something deeper, or has it been going on? The word that's commonly used is it systemic in the nature between the community and police enforcement, law enforcement?
I guess I will tackle that. I'm a little bit of a history buff, so you have to go back to why the police agencies were formed in the United States from the beginning. So, and for those that don't know, I see there are several phones out here, you can Google this. The police departments were formed to corral and bring in, quote unquote, runaway slaves. So when the beginning of the foundation is cracked, then the whole house is no good. So we have to go back to the beginning and fix what has gone on in the beginning. And I know we see some tapping on the phone. You can go ahead and look that up if you want to, and we'll talk about it afterwards. But we have to discuss why the police force actually came into being. And so that culture, for those that know me and have been around me, hear me use that word all the time, when that culture is passed down from rank to rank and generation to generation, it is unspoken, but it is there. I hope that I answered your question, Mr. Lloyd.
Well, you gave me an answer.
Oh, okay. Right.
No, from what I gather from you, you're saying that there's something systemic in the midst of that.
Correct. That is correct.
I think what he's saying is that because it began that way, you know, the system set out to achieve a particular end at the beginning, and the system was made for that. And so, if I'm, and you correct me if I'm misstating you, what you're saying is, if that's the reason something, the why of the police was to corral runaway slaves, well, we got to look at that why and see, is that still, what does that look like as it's gone over time? Because if that's, if it's just changed methods, then it is systemic. Am I saying that correctly?
You are exactly correct, because the purpose or the reasoning for the police department has not changed. So therefore, we have to tackle the root problem. Instead of covering it up and using code words, let's address the issue. And I was advised that this is not a politically correct forum this evening, because in order to have an honest dialogue, we cannot be politically correct this evening. So yes, sir, you hit the nail right on the head. Thank you.
I want to comment on the point that Alonzo made, because I don't totally agree with you, and I don't totally disagree with you, Alonzo, but I think one of the reasons that you have law enforcement in this country and in any country, and property rights in this country, was very important to the founders, very important. And they created law enforcement to protect their property, whether they had slaves or not. So even in areas where you don't have slaves, you have property, and people are going to want to protect it. Now, obviously, you're right. In some areas, you do have slaves. They were considered property, i.e. law enforcement was going to protect, go after runaway slaves. But runaway slaves themselves was not the reason that law enforcement was created. The primary reason is to protect people and to protect their property. So you're going to find that to be the case whether you have slavery or not. Now, if you're bringing up the point that a lot of this is related to race, we can throw that out on the table right now. I can't speak for Chief Connolly, but I would agree with you. In all of the areas where we have talked about where there has been problems with law enforcement and the community, a lot of friction and confrontation, they are areas where, and the issue with race is primarily with African Americans, and maybe to a limited degree Hispanics in some places, but certainly with African Americans, and certainly with African Americans that are lower on the economic scale. I think a point that you were going to earlier, and obviously that doesn't mean that people are more criminal because of that, but that is where the conflict is, and I think that's where people most have the perceptions that law enforcement is not looking out for their rights, but they're looking out for the rights of other people.
I think there's something there too with the fact that, and I think you hit something really interesting. Your perspective is that the police is coming to get you. I mean, that you're the target. Like you're the police isn't coming to protect you. Runaway slave, a modern day runaway slave. The police is coming to get you, to take you in, and I think that's going to be. I think that's a narrative that is that I think we'll see, sort of as we talk through tonight, I think we'll see that narrative, I think, is in the minds of many folks in the community and is in the way of a solid relationship between the two entities.
You know, I'm glad we kind of brought, Assistant Chief, you kind of brought this thing, let's throw race out onto the table. I know when most people are discussing the relationship between law enforcement and the community, I think if they would visualize it, I think that they visualize an African-American individual as the representative of the community. Would you disagree with that? And in the midst of that, I want to just make sure we test the temperature on that. Do we think that this enmity that exists is a race issue? Do we think that that's the piece? Antoine, I'm going to ask you that. Do you think race is the piece that is actually going on? Do you think that there's a conflict between that?
I don't. I think that it is, at minimum, if we had to choose an ism, I think there may be classism associated with that. But I think that whether it's a race issue or not, the conversation, I think that race brings us, I think race divides the room. I think the word divides the room. I don't like to talk about race, and we will tonight, but I don't like to talk about race in this conversation because suddenly I get on the other side of someone who's a different race than me, and I have to protect myself, and they have to protect themselves. Suddenly we're not talking about the issue, we're talking about protecting our individual identities. So I don't know that it's a race issue. I would prefer to frame the argument as a power issue and an authority issue and a rights issue. And I would prefer to say that we have a very powerful entity inflicting perhaps too much power on a, for lack of a better term, weak entity. And I think that if we were to police the police where power is concerned, I think that we can gather the room together and tackle that. Nobody roots for Goliath, you know, and whenever Goliath beats up David, it doesn't matter what race you are, you don't like to see that. And so I think that is a more solution-based conversation. It includes racism and sexism and just about any other ism where power is overused. And so I think it's a power issue, not a race issue.
I was just going to say, how do we even begin to police the police? I mean, could you explain a little bit more?
Well, the citizens have a lot of power when they're together.
I agree.
So when the citizens say, as a city or as a collective, when that collective says, "Hey, we don't want to see abuse of power in our police department or in our law enforcement," in America, the collective people have the greatest power. Well, again, the greatest power is in the collective. What we have is a divisive attack, if you will, at what we see as injustice, and we're mixing up. I believe we're mixing up the battlefields. You know, we're not focused it all in the right direction. If we could get everyone unified and pointed in the right direction, then we can. And that's police officers. That's the law enforcement leadership, like the folks on this panel, as well as the citizens. When we're all looking at the same things, using the right glasses, I think as a collective, you have a stronger voice.
Now, how do you guys respond to that idea of the abuse of power? I know that's something it's a narrative that kind of pops up every now and again, especially considering some of the cases that we've seen on television. We see that individuals are unarmed. In fact, I have a question from the audience is how do we minimize the situation between officers and unarmed individuals? So that's kind of two questions. But first of all, how do we minimize the situation, but how do you even respond to this idea of the abuse of power?
Well, certainly power can be abused. When you're given great power, you also have great responsibility that comes with that because you can abuse that power that's placed in your hands. So I don't think Chief Drain or myself would sit up here and tell you that power is never abused. It happens. It happens in every profession. There are people in every profession that mess up and abuse their office. What we have to have is police leadership and a community that trusts the leadership to take care of those abuses of power. You know, when you talk about oversight of police, I think the community does need to exercise that oversight and say, this is what we demand of our officers, and hold the people who are running the show there accountable for that. That doesn't mean we'll never make a mistake. That doesn't mean someone won't abuse the power. But is there systemic abuse? And I think that comes to, you know, it almost depends on whose eyes you're looking through. And that's a lot that we're trying to do with police officers, to help them understand the perspectives of other people in the community. You know, I sit and see the world in a certain way. I was raised up in a certain area, in a certain culture, a certain family. This is the way we view the world. So I see an incident and I see something totally different, or I feel about it differently. We go back to that idea of what Antoine brought up, our emotions. We emote and feel about what we see much differently because of our experience. And what we try to do with our officers is help them understand how other people look at things. And that's always going to be an issue. I don't know that that's a problem we're going to accomplish or deal with overnight. But we're dealing with great changes in society. We're dealing with changes in policing. And from my perspective, policing is much better in America than it's ever been. I would take issue with Alonzo's, you know, saying this is why policing started. Certainly, I think Chief Drain answered some of that. There are some elements there. But we see policing rise up in all areas, in all societies, because people want to feel safe. People want to control. We talk about property rights. You know, I was talking with someone earlier tonight on the panel, and I don't remember who, but thinking, do we want a world without police? Nobody really wants that. We want the police, but we want them to act appropriately. We want them to protect everyone equally under the law.
Do you feel, in the midst of that, and maybe this is for you, Assistant Chief, I mean, you know, I want to bring back, again, to kind of to deal with this race discussion, because I think that's the elephant in the room. Michelle Alexander, her book, The New Jim Crow, brings us a stat that says 90% of African-American young males in most major cities are under some type of control of sort of government control, whether it's on parole, in prison, those types of things. But then she goes on to say, even in the prisons, that it's majority of the people who are in prisons are African Americans, and mostly on sort of drug crimes. If it's not a race issue, why do we see such a large amount of one particular race incarcerated as opposed to another?
I did read her book, The New Jim Crow, and it's been a couple of years. I think it came out in probably 2012, so it's been probably at least 2 years that I read it. And from what I recall, Marcus, is that she did primarily focus on drugs. Mm-hmm. And at the time that she wrote her book, excuse me, under federal sentencing guidelines, there were some issues, I think, that went back to previous presidential administrations on how they had different sentencing for crack cocaine versus powdered cocaine when it comes to mandatory sentencing. And if you don't know, the Obama administration now has done away with that, you know, and I think they did that about a year ago or 18 months ago. So that part has been done. And then even many of the states like New York and some others that had mandatory sentencing at the state level, they've also done away with those rules as well too. Now she is focusing primarily on drugs, and there is a lot of data out there that whites, blacks, Hispanics all use drugs in about equal amounts, but more African Americans do end up in prison. That is something that, based on my research, that I do believe. But I think it's part of the reasons, and I think back to my experience in Plano. When I first arrived in Plano in the early 90s, crack was a problem. Crack cocaine was a problem. Heroin was a problem. But when the heroin users, though, they're in there, and a lot of the heroin users were middle class or upper middle class, but they are using the drugs inside of their houses. That's, you know, they're doing transactions that are not visible to the community to the same degree, and therefore they weren't having the same impact. Obviously, if we could have found out about them, we would have arrested them. But when you are in the Douglas community, which is right across the street from the police department, and you've got kids out there playing ball, and you've got cans that are burnt out from crack, you've got needles, you've got condoms, you've got all this stuff going on out in the open, it is going to attract more of a police response than someone who's smoking pot or even if they're shooting up heroin in their house. And that is part of the reasons I think that the police have focused more on the African American community, because in the African American community, the drugs have had a greater impact, negative impact on that community than it has on the white community, the larger white community, and it forces the police hands to have to get in there and go deal with that. So again, I did read Michelle Alexander's book. I think there are a lot of her points that I agree with, especially a lot of the historical points that she brought up. I think were very good, but I think you know, you have to address the answer for why so many of our African American young men are in jail when you move away from drugs. Part of it is because a lot of them are criminals. And when you're a criminal, that's where you're likely to end up, is in jail. So when you continue to commit crimes, that is what's going to happen, I think. So, and I don't think she focused enough on that issue when she put her book out talking about the statistics. You know, I didn't see anything in there to imply that the people that were in prison were not guilty of the offenses that they had been accused of.
It's an interesting thing. I'll throw it in there because I think that's something I know in the narrative, in the discussion, people will say, well, you know, if the problem is that if people just obeyed laws, there would be no issue. Do you agree with that, Alonzo, specifically over in the area where you are? Is that something that you can kind of go, yeah, that's pretty much the reason why everything's happening?
Well, I can understand, and I apologize for those that are working the mic. I have a drill sergeant voice, so I hope everyone can hear me. I'm trying to be soft-spoken this evening. I can relate to the assistant chief's perspective, but when you mention that they're in jail because they are criminals, but you have to look at the laws that are in place to be considered a criminal. And that's why I say, again, you have to go back to the history of it all and understanding that, and you open it up so eloquently when you mentioned about our founding fathers and how we had to learn these things, and understanding about the Constitution, and understanding that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment shifted some things to the hands of the state versus individuals. But at that time, to be black in America, you were still a criminal. So when you look at the element, or thinking that I'm going into a particular neighborhood, and I'll use some of those buzzwords that are out there, an urban community, the police officer's expectations is that I'm going to deal with a bunch of criminals. And that element is not in the play when you are in more suburban areas. So we also have to look at not the fact of automatically assuming that people that are in the inner city or a certain area or a certain community are criminals. You have to look at the laws that are in place. The majority of those that are of color cannot afford legal counsel. So they are appointed counsel, and the counsel is overloaded with cases, and they have them to, as we say, cop a plea. So then when you enter a plea, you're at the mercy of the judge. Whereas someone else that is from a more affluent community, they can afford an attorney doing the same quote-unquote crime, and they get probation or a slap on the wrist, or they get labeled with a new disease called affluenza. So these are the things that we really need to address. And I'm not here to attack the police department. I have friends and relatives that are on police departments. So, excuse me. So I'm not here to bash the police department. Again, not only a history buff, I love movies. So again, I'm going to use a lot of analogies. The best one that I could use is the movie The Matrix. And you mentioned, Brother Moderator, about is it systemic? So the root word of that still gets into the system. So anyone that is still plugged into the system is a potential agent, regardless of race, color, gender, culture, whatever the case may be. And we have to understand that originally the system became flawed in the Matrix because there was a virus. So if we don't address the real issue in the room, then we will leave here with everyone still scratching their heads and not having a better understanding as a community and not having a better understanding as law enforcement.
So you talk about the real issue in the room. What is that real issue?
We're skating around race and racism. You mentioned it, but we're still kind of not really diving into it.
Well,
when I was a kid, we used to go swimming and we would just run and what we call the nesting plunge, just run and just dive in. We never, you know, a few people just put their foot in the water and then they jump in. Well, I just get in there. So let's get in there and discuss the real issues.
Splash.
Yes.
You know, I want to address a couple of the points Alonzo brought up. And, you know, your point about are there police officers who go into predominantly African-American community and see criminals everywhere? I don't doubt that that's the case. I don't think that we have an issue with that in Plano because it's just not that kind of a community where we have that much where, you know, it's not a Ferguson or a Baltimore or something along those lines. So I don't think that's the case there. But you know, when you talk about the criminal justice system and people not having money, if you're accused of a crime and if you don't have any money, it doesn't matter what your race is, then you may be treated more harshly by that system than if you're somebody with means and resources and connections. In other words, I'm going back to the point Antoine makes. A lot of this is about class. It is about the resources that you have. And if you're O.J. Simpson and who is a black man, you know, if that had been a poor white man with all the evidence set against them, they would have been to prison a long time ago. O.J. was black, accused of killing white people, but yet he got off because O.J. Simpson was wealthy. So it is about money. If you have resources, and I don't mean that at the police level, I'm talking about that at the court level when you go to trial, and I believe that that is the case. I want to bring up another point, too, when we talk about race. You know, I was born in 1960 in East Texas, you know, and I went to segregated schools through the 4th grade. And at the time, the law enforcement agency, at the time, not now, in the small town where I grew up, was very racist. There is no doubt about that. I knew that as a kid in the 60s and the 70s. Someone blew up all the school buses when we were supposed to segregate the schools. You know, 3 brothers, 3 sisters, 1 bathroom in the house, mom and dad, 1 bathroom in the house, very, very poor. You know, and every time I saw the movie Roots, I wanted to go out and go beat up a white person. You know, I mean, that's the way it was, you know, when I grew up, because that was my environment. But I went off to college, I went off to military, it expanded my mind, and I realized how blessed I was, especially when I went to other countries, to be born in this country. And that's what changed my mind for me. Now, with a background like mine, and I've got brothers, siblings, that have had serious trouble with law enforcement because they were criminals. That's why they had that trouble. But with a background like mine, do you think, and everybody who comes to the Plano Police Department has to sit on a board that I chair before they go in to go see the chief, do you think I would willingly hire a racist in my police department, or that I would stand by and allow someone who I knew was a racist to continue to do that? These scenarios are not as simple as people believe sometimes. And when things happen, you have to hear the citizen out, you have to give the officer due process, you have to collect the facts, and you have to make a call on it. And they're not always as clear and clear cut as what it may appear from a Twitter feed. That's the only point that I'm trying to make. So what I would ask the community to do when something happens, at least have some trust in your police department to give them an opportunity to investigate what happened before you assume everything about it. Now, that also puts some pressure on us in law enforcement. We should be reaching out before things happen, and this is what we try to do in Plano, reach out to all aspects of our community, and we have the word partnership in our mission statement, and we believe in that with our African American community, with our Hispanic community, with businesses, with patriotic groups. You've got to reach out before there are problems, because then people will allow you the time, because you know each other. You've already talked. There's not an African American pastor in Plano you can bring up that I haven't met and I don't know, because sometimes problems are going to come up, but if they trust you and if they know you, they'll give you time to go through the facts, and if the officer is wrong, you hold him accountable, and if you don't think he's wrong, this is why he did what he did or what she did. And so that's the comments that I wanted to make on that.
Well, and I want to just tag on here to Chief Drain's comments. Certainly that's been my experience as far as who we're bringing into this profession. We're not perfect, but we're not hiring racist cops. And sometimes we talk about this whole system, and we wandered off into things that the police don't control. And sometimes we're kind of the point of spear of government and society, but we don't control everything that's out there. The sentencing, the laws, there are things that are beyond that are really out of our hands as a police agency to deal with. There are greater societal forces going on that we're taking care of. But it is important that we develop these relationships in the community. One thing that helped me in coming up here, when we had our incident at the pool party, several people reached out. There were several groups that came in. The closest organized branch of the NAACP was in Garland, which played to my benefit, having come from Garland. Those folks know me. We had relationships. The former president of the NAACP was on the Garland City Council. The message he sent up is said, "I know Chief Conley, he'll take care of it." The president of the NAACP, Mr. Ricky Neal, came up, and we know each other, and he trusts me. And that's what we've got to do. Sometimes the knee-jerk reaction to things like that is you want to blame the whole system. You know, certainly I think Alonzo has that perspective, but if you say, well, it's just this whole system, they're all racist. I don't think that's really true. That's my perspective on it. But, you know, you've got to deal with these individual issues, and you've got to have built that kind of trust with people that they can come and say, okay, we know who you are, we know what you're all about, and to understand, to get to know who these officers are and what they're all about. We have to deal with criminals. We go into a community, we get calls from the east side of McKinney, which is a historically, economically disadvantaged community. I got 2 calls today from folks over there saying, hey, there's drug dealing. We want, you know, straighten this up. There's disorder in the community. They want us over there to deal with it. So their perspective when we come over is we're dealing with a problem they see. Some people's perspective when we come over is, you know, we're these racist cops coming in to deal with people for a different reason. And I think that the thing is we've got to keep having sessions like this. We've got to reach out. We've got to keep building this relationship. The reaction, and what I was headed to in all this, one of the reactions from the pool party, many people said we need more training for the police. We've got to train the police in diversity. We've got to train the police. We do a lot of training. We do a lot of diversity training. I know Chief Drain and I have been through tons of it. And we're giving our police training. But what we need to do is develop relationships with people. We've got to teach them how to develop relationships in the community and change that focus in policing to where they're going in and understanding how you build relationships with people. You can sit and talk to me about this community and that community. I can understand everything that happens in the Japanese world. That's not going to make me a good police officer in that community unless I begin to develop relationships and we humanize that interaction between us.
You mentioned this idea of we don't hire racists, and one of the people in the audience said, how do you know? How do you identify a racist?
Well, what I said was I would not willingly hire a racist, so I don't have any kind of special vision where I can look inside someone's heart or inside of their head. But the process that we use, though, to get around that is a very detailed background investigation. We call their employers, we go to their houses where they live. If they've worked in law enforcement before, we go to those agencies and actually pull the records and see what type of confrontations and complaints they've had from citizens. So that's how we do that. We go through an oral board process and we have questions on there about some of the very things that we're talking about here today to get their responses. And quite frankly, we're looking for low-hanging fruit because someone who is smart is not, and if they are a racist, they're going to answer accordingly. They know what to say. But occasionally we do find some low-hanging fruit. We pick it and we throw it away when we get that. So, but that's the process that we use. So, but I can't guarantee you that we don't hire racists. And we also have to keep in mind too, you can bring people into this job and then they go through divorces, they have problems with kids, they get illnesses, they get worries, and just like other people, and people can change. People can change. We go through, and police officers go through a very detailed, long 4-hour psychological testing process, but you still have police officers who turn out later on in this job to have psychological problems. Some of them even take their own lives. So, and we go through a more detailed and probably take their own lives to a greater degree than the general public who doesn't have all that testing that we go through. So people can change over time. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. I thought you were done. So what I hear you saying is you're not a department that's looking for racists. You know, it's not like you're out there scouting for racists to try to put a badge on them. You know, but you're trying to make sure that you have the right people on it. And I think saying it the other way may help. You know, I know that you said, you know, we do everything we can to keep racists out, but sometimes if we say that it's a systemic problem, then that would imply that we're looking for racist cops. You know, in order to work in the system. There are some realities, I think, to the racism conversation, though, that I'd like to talk a little bit about, and that is the fact that in a general situation, especially when you're dealing with lower class, or if we want to say African American communities, you have a significant level of fear there that you don't normally have, and I don't think this is a police exclusive thing. I mean, if I go to you know, if I find myself in LA and go to the inner city of Compton, I'm probably going to look over my shoulder a little bit more than I would if I was in Hollywood as a citizen, because I'm entering into what I suspect is, if I were to break it down, a desperate and therefore unpredictable scenario. And because it's lower class, and for lack of a better term right now, everyone's fighting to eat or fighting to survive, fighting to go, then we have a more desperate and therefore unpredictable scenario. Add to that if I have a badge on and I'm the icon of the oppression, I'm the icon of a system that oppresses me, then oppresses this neighborhood. Now I don't like the cop, not because he's a cop, not because he's white, but because he represents a system that holds me down, and I don't like him. So I have my fear, and I'm afraid of him, and I think he's here to get me, and so I'm itchy. And the cop is walking to the situation knowing this is an unpredictable scenario and anything could happen here, and so that cop is itchy. And now you have you have all the elements for a combustible situation just waiting to happen in the course of 2 to 3 seconds of decision making, because we don't have because of these elements. But we have to admit that these environments create, going into the environments raises the tension level, for various reasons, and they may be race related, they may not be. It's just the way that those situations are, the environments.
So I want to speak to in the middle of that, because I think that's an interesting point, is this idea of, you know, people talked about, I know when Ferguson started and when some of the other things have started, they talked about outsiders coming in and pouring gasoline on a flame. And one of the questions that I've heard many times is, well, what created the flame, right? Like, there was a flame. You can't pour gasoline on this ground and get fire because there's no fire there. So there was a flame there. So what I want to get to is we have all the rhetoric that we're talking about right now, but there is still, and I think we can all agree on this, there's still this sense of mistrust between the African American community, particularly, and law enforcement. What is the genesis of that? Like, beyond even going back, the cops were made for this, but why does it still exist today?
I think and again, Antoine touched on some of this, is that in areas where you have a lot of poverty and there's a lot of desperation, there is going to be crime. There is going to be crime in those communities. Now, but I think we want to be careful on necessarily focusing and saying it's race related. The people that we're talking about may be predominantly black, but if you take Ferguson, that was a city that was almost 70% African American. As I recall, they had 3 African Americans on a department out of with 53 officers, so 6% or whatever in a population that's almost 70%. Every elected position in municipal government was a white person. Now you flip the switch and you go to Baltimore. The mayor was black, the police chief was black, the district attorney is black. A large percentage of the officers on the department is black. The officers involved in the Freddie Gray, most of them are African American. So I don't think that that's a racial issue there. but you still have some of the exact same symptoms in Baltimore that you have in Ferguson when you don't have a white majority that's doing this. So I think we just have to be careful on how we can some of that. And another point I want to bring up too is, in my community in Plano, the traditional African American community is called the Douglas community. I'm sure many have heard of. And someone you and I both know, Pastor Hodges and others, have called us down there before, and rarely is it to call us down there to talk about how brutal or how oppressive the police are. The reason they call those community meetings is because there's been an uptick in crime. There's been an uptick in people finding needles in their backyard. That's what they're calling about. There's been an uptick in the kids can't walk home from the daycare center. They're talking about the crime is getting up, and they're wanting to see a larger police presence out there. That's what we get calls about. Trying to go out over there and to protect that community is by far more calls that we get than we get about complaints about the officers being too aggressive or treating everybody like criminals. They want to see more of the criminals put away, and that's why they contact us and set up meetings.
I'm going to get Alonzo wanted to say something, then Michael, I'll let you jump in if that's okay.
Yes, I wanted to clarify something because Chief Conley, out of the exchange that we've had here thus far, you mentioned something, and I must address it before we go any further. When you mentioned about my perspective is that every cop is a racist, that's if that's the way that came across, that was not my intent. What I was mentioning is again the system. And Chief Drain, you touched on this as well, and I mentioned it before. Just by show of hands, how many of you have seen the movie The Matrix? It did not matter what race, color, or creed, or gender you were in that movie. If you were still plugged into the system that had a virus, then you were a potential agent. It had nothing to do with color per se. I'm simply saying that from the beginning, the system was flawed. This is for those that are studying a little bit of science. Do we know how penicillin came about? Just anyone, I know can't speak from the artist, but just do this if you know how penicillin came about. It did not come about initially to save lives. And that's what I was going back from the beginning about the police system. It was not the intent to serve and protect in the beginning. It was to corral and round up individuals that were seeking freedom. So that was my point that I was trying to make. Not saying that every cop is a racist. I'm simply saying if there's a virus in the system, then everyone that is still connected to that system, and Brother Antoine mentioned on it, and the actual definition of dealing with race or racism, you have to involve power, the misuse and abuse of power. So that's the point that I was trying to make earlier, mentioning before about it being systemic. It's not just the police department being the arms and the legs of law. You get into the court system as well. So it's not just, and I wish we had a judge or someone here that was representing the courts on this evening. So Chief, I don't want you to leave here tonight thinking that every time I see a cop, it's like, okay, here we go. Let me get my phones out and start videoing and yelling. That's not the point that I was making. I'm saying from the beginning it was wrong. Let's address the issue and make it right.
Well, I'm going to I understand what you're saying, and I didn't mean to intimate that you think every cop's a racist, but that making the system racist in some way, and then you bring that up, I don't believe that I would go to my police department and say, these folks aren't racist. If we find somebody who is, we'll deal with it. But in general, I don't believe that they are. I'll deal with it as best I can. I can't look in everybody's hearts. I don't know everything. I can't deal with the whole system. Mostly what our purpose here is tonight, from my perspective, is to deal with the relationship between our community and our police department. And so that the folks out here can feel like they have ownership, that this is their police department and it's responsive to their needs today. I would argue with you a little bit about the beginning of policing. We could look at English policing. We could go into all that, but that's really, I can't change the whole system. I can't change the whole world. I can't change the whole United States. But what I hope that we can do here is make a difference between the folks in McKinney, the people who live here, and the police department that serves them. George Kelling was a well-known sociologist and criminal justice writer, and he said the genius of American policing is local government control. You have control over your police department. You have a voice in your police department. You can dialogue with your police department. If all we had was a national police department, it would be really hard to have any kind of local change in dialogue. And while I can't change everything in the system, what I can do as chief is work in our community, work with our folks who live here. So the folks who live here say, you know, the McKinney Police Department, you can trust them. If there is something wrong, you can trust the leadership to take care of it. And I think that's what I can hope to get to as a chief.
Alonzo, you keep saying that the system is flawed, right? So what is your solution to sort of fixing the system if it is indeed flawed?
Well, Chief Conley touched on it from the beginning. It's about having a relationship. And I will say that I know Chief Conley's record before he and I knew each other personally back in Garland. So I don't want anyone to think that we're personally at odds here this evening. That's why I said it's about having a healthy dialogue. I'm pretty sure before the evening is done that I will offend probably everybody in the room. So when I came in, I made sure that I knew where all the exits were. So again, it's about having a relationship and having a healthy dialogue that is not politically correct. Because being politically correct will get us exactly to where we are today. And you look at everything that has taken place today, we're reliving what my parents experienced 50 years ago because we did not address the issue when it came to heart to heart.
And is the issue the systematic problem?
Yes.
Okay.
The
system.
Without a doubt, and we get back again, and Chief Drain mentioned on it, and it's kind of like when someone says about being successful, we used to hear that all the time. They had Michael Jordan and Oprah. They would always throw up Michael Jordan and Oprah. But if you can only mention one black case to where, and I will say this because it's going to offend some people, OJ did it. Now, I got that out in the open. So, you know, and so when the issue with OJ is brought up and says, well, yes, well, I'm going to say got off. I will because I'm not politically correct. That he got off and we throw that one instance. But then I can, mention John Jackson and Joe Smith and all these others that were black. And you have another gentleman to come in that is what considered as white, same crime, same issues, and that gentleman gets to go home with his family in the evening. So these are the issues that have to be addressed. I've been dealing with mothers and fathers that have called me in the middle of the night crying because their children have children have received 10 years in the big house, as we call it, for something that was petty that it should be there for. So these are the issues that we have to address. We can't skate it up under the rug. Again, I'm not trying to make it the community against the police. I'm simply saying the perspective. And Chief Conley mentioned this, and I'm on my soapbox, and I'll get off in just a moment. Mentioned about the pool party. The exchange in the beginning was about you folks go back over there to your Section 8 housing, not knowing that those children didn't live in that community, didn't live in Section 8 housing. So when we talk about it not being a racial issue, it is a racial issue. So we must address the elephant in the room that's knocking over all the chairs and knocking over some of the equipment, and we want to ignore it. And then by the other perspective, we can't automatically assume that when we see an officer, that officer is coming to do us harm. But it's a sad day when I see on social media, and we brought that up before, when people say, well, at least she got to go home and no one got shot. That's a sad state in America when the only thing you can come out of that exchange is, well, no one got shot. I'm gonna leave it at that. I'm gonna slide my soapbox.
Michael, did you have something to say?
It's purely anecdotal, but I know that in movies and stuff they typically show. I worked in a prison in the state of Texas, and they typically show Caucasian white officers and stuff. But at the unit I worked at, we housed about 650 inmates and we had about 75 officers. 3/4 of the officers were African American. And so I never felt that there was really any race issue at all. The issues that were there were gang-related issues. And yes, sometimes gangs will, well, not sometimes, many of the gangs will segregate themselves based on race, but the officers weren't doing that. The officers were treating everyone equally and treating everyone the same based on the crimes that they committed in the unit. So I never at one time ever felt that there was any race issue whatsoever with any of the officers. They would have been there and had my back the same as I would have had their back any time.
I want to address just a real quick point too, Alonzo, that you made a minute ago, and I think Chief Conley, both and I have acknowledged that there are problems with police in the community in some places. We've also acknowledged that there will be isolated instances of officers misbehaving on any police department. That can happen. I think the true test of that department is what is it that they do to hold that officer accountable. But the point I wanted to go back is you said that we're seeing policing is like it was 50 years ago. I don't think any objective person can say that. If you look at the movie Selma, I'm 50 years old, so I know what it was like, even 30 years ago. Policing has changed in the 20-something years that I have been in it. It has changed. So yeah, do we have these isolated cases? Maybe even in some places systemic problems, but nothing like policing was in this country back in the 50s and the 60s or even the 70s. Not even close, in my opinion.
Would you say that things are better now than they have ever been?
Yes.
So why the problem? Or why the Black Lives Matter?
Because people like me keep getting killed. And that's why I go back to 50 years ago. Whatever your method, whether you use German shepherds, water hoses, hanging, whatever the case may be, dead is dead. So I know at the hands of police officers that unarmed black and brown young men and young women are dying. That is something that we must address. That is factual. That's not dealing with perspective. That's not dealing with whatever the case may be. We're dying. So when I say that go back to 50 years ago, we're still addressing the same issue that no one can explain how unarmed black and brown people end up in the grave.
I think our response to the realities have to be what we can do about it. What I mean by that is race is a subjective accusation. If I see something on a video and it's a white cop and a black kid, I subjectively say that's racism, but there's nothing in the video that says it's racism. Therefore, I could sit in front of a judge and say, hey, that's racism, and that's not provable. I can't put action on racism. However, and this goes back to my power versus racism. However, what I do see is someone with power and authority who is overexerting perhaps their power and authority on an individual, and I can do something about over abuse of power. See, the reality of when I talk about power over race, I'm not saying that race doesn't exist. I'm saying I can't make racist people not racist. That's what I'm saying. And the answer, if the answer to the problem is let's make America prejudice free, that is unrealistic. However, racism acted out through my badge looks like power abuse. And I can do something about power abuse. And if I can change the conversation to that, all of a sudden we don't have the divided lines. Now the second thing, and we're done, but the second thing is we talked about systemic, and this is a word, systemic, we had to make sure we're right, we're all talking about the same things here. Because systemic could mean, hey, all police officers, you're going to get a bonus for as many black people as you can shoot or arrest. That might be a form of systemic. However, I think systemic, maybe the way that you're thinking about it is there's the police, there's the judicial system, there's the economical structure, there's an entire connectivity of lifestyle an environment within when a person lives that informs their interaction with the police. So now the police is just one piece of a larger constructed system. So these are two different versions of the word system, because if I say systemic, then that means I've seen systemic. Systemic does look like water hoses and Doberman pictures, and that's very clear that they are doing what they're doing in a systemic way. But today, man, we got millions of cops interacting with millions of citizens, and if we have 100 really bad cops do something bad to African American people, you know, in a month, that still numerically doesn't make systemic, because you got 100 over millions of interactions. And if it was systemic, in my opinion, systemic would mean that we have more of that behavior than we don't have of that behavior. We don't. We see these offshoots, and they happen in succession across the country, and it taps on that same emotional point, and it makes us feel, oh my gosh, this is everywhere all the time. When in reality, there's millions of cops, police officers enforcing millions of, and interacting with millions of people throughout the country. So we have to be careful to define systemic, because I think on one level of the conversation, I don't know that I would say that we have a systemic police oppression problem, but I might be able to walk into an idea that we have a social systemic issue for the lower class that creates and enables explosive interactions between the police and those citizens inside of that system.
So kind of, we've grabbed that, and you've made a point that seems to put us at a place where we can't do much with it, right? In the sense of racism is something that is very hard to determine these days. I think about the case back in 1987, McCluskey versus Kemp, where the Supreme Court ruled basically in favor of a situation where it was impossible now to prove that there was any racism being done in an interaction between somebody in the community and an officer, unless it was using a particular racial slur and those types of things. So we now have this situation where we're in a process. Do we think that there's nothing to do, or do we start to work on this power situation? In the midst of that, I can't help but recognize that there is an outcry, or there's lines being drawn in America around this. How does the media play into this drawing of lines, do you think?
Is that to me?
To whomever. And not just social media, but the media. This is a question from the audience.
I think the media needs news, and I think the news is, the news is about entertainment. And it's entertainment, whether it's a ice storm coming and oh my God, goes by all the bread and the milk, which, by the way, who buys bread? I don't want to. What does bread and milk have to do with ice? But whatever. So, but whether it's oh my God, it's the worst storm ever. Whether it's that, which is an emotional fear, you know, or it's whatever it is, it plays on emotion, because we live in a society that really loves its emotions. It is not real unless I feel it. And so to get the things that they need, they create these emotional things. What we need is community leaders in the community leaders who have perspectives, more holistic perspectives, that will be the buffer to the emotional outcries, and be the voice for the community where the emotional actually signifies that something real is a problem. So now we need both of those things.
So now you're talking to some extent about solutions, and I know, Michael, you look like you wanted to play into some of the psychology maybe behind some of that, but I want to talk. You just had that look, but maybe not. Talking about solutions. So, Chief and Assistant Chief, you know, we have this what appears to be this, you know, lines being drawn. We have sort of media that is creating some of these things, possibly. We have what is valid really feelings of people in the community about how they feel about the police and the use of power. What is the solution? Because as much as we want to sit and go, yeah, okay, it's not racism, or yeah, we know we're flawed and we're all these things, that doesn't change the situation. So there has to be some type of solution to be done, some type of stepping across the line and sort of making a stand. So speak to that a little bit, how you're looking to do that.
Yeah, I think we see a lot of that going on we're starting some things in McKinney, but I want to kind of harken back to some things they do in Plano, things that are done in Garland. They have very, very active neighborhood police officer programs. They have very active community outreach programs. They've been very successful in reaching into their community. And I think as we see the rapid growth, the rapid change in the community of McKinney, that we need to have those same kind of organizational programs going on. As we've become a mid-sized city, a mid-sized police department, we've got to get these things happening. We've got to make sure that we don't lose that connection and actually build new connections in the community. So one thing that I'm proposing to do is start a neighborhood police officer program. It's been very successful in Plano, very successful in Garland. We were at a time, I would say in the late 90s in Garland, going into the early 2000s, where our community relations weren't good. We were having some very difficult times. But we put together a community leaders group, which I'm currently trying to put together as an advisory board to the chief. We put together neighborhood police officers, and we really saw a sea change over the last decade and a half of our relationships in the community and the level of trust that the community is giving their police department. That's the only thing. I can't fix everybody. I can't fix the United States, but what we can do and what those of us who live here in McKinney can do is we can work on those relationships, building bridges between the police department and the community, and make sure that communication's going on. No, sometimes we'll disagree. No, sometimes we're going to have different perspectives on issues, but we're still communicating. We're still talking. We respect one another, and I think that's how we're going to continue to do this. That's what I heard from the community when we had our issue. I still have contact particularly with many of the pastors. A lot of people said, hey, we don't want the outside people coming in. We'll take care of this. And I think that truly was the attitude. We don't want to lose that. We'll take care of this. Doesn't mean we'll ignore it. Doesn't mean we're going to sweep it under the rug, but it means we'll take care of it ourselves. We don't need CNN. We don't need somebody trying to make a name for themselves. We live here. And that's one thing I said to the folks that met with me. I said, when all this is gone, when the lights and camera and the circus is out of town, we're all still going to live here. And we've got to work together to make this community. And that's the message that came back to me, that we need to work together as a community to continue to build these bridges. And I appreciate you guys having this meeting tonight.
Yeah, and here's a question for you, Assistant Chief, is he referenced Plano and how they were kind of doing it. How do you measure the success of a program like this that the Chief has mentioned, and maybe a program that if you guys have done something similar in Plano? How do you measure the success of that?
Well, how we measure success is we actually do surveys. We actually do 3 surveys a year with people who have had contact with the police department, and then for the fourth quarter we will do one with just Plano residents, and we'll send it out to Plano residents, and we ask them questions about those very things and see what comments that we get back. Our city also, now that's an internal survey that we, the police department, is doing, and then our city every 2 years will go out and bring in a consultant to do surveys where they ask how the police department is doing, and all city departments actually, and then we get those results back and we take a look at that. So that's one way on how we measure that. But Chief Connolly primarily talked about, and some things that I had talked about earlier, was what the police department ought to be doing, because again, we're talking about solutions, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that and we've acknowledged that in individual cases, officers may just flat mess up. And so what we have to do as a community is you have to hold those officers accountable. And I will talk with friends of mine, in my fraternity and my family, and they'll bring up an anecdotal case, as Michael talked about earlier, and I said, well, did you report it? Well, it'll be something that happened 8-9 months ago. They never reported it to the police. So what I want to challenge people to do, regardless of whether you are white, black, Hispanic, a student or whatever, if you have a problem, if you don't think you were treated right on a traffic stop, you have some rights. Some of those are, we have to abide by. Most police departments in Texas are going to have video. So what I would say to you, that if you disagree with the officer, don't act the fool on the video, because that could be the thing that, you know, you don't want to use that to where people say, well, of course that officer had to do these things to them because they were acting a fool. So keep calm, keep professional. And the other thing I want to say is if you have a disagreement with the officer, comply now, complain later. You have that right to complain on that officer. You have the right to get access to that video. We are required to keep video for 90 days by law, and in some agencies will keep it longer, and they'll keep it longer if it's related to any kind of an investigation or an internal complaint. Get the video, look at it, let somebody else look at it, and if you think that the officer was not professional, file a complaint. That agency has to take your complaint. You know, you just write it down, and then they'll give you a response back. At least you've got something in writing. The other thing that I would ask you to do too, in most cities, at least in most municipalities, the police department is going to be the individual department that spends the most money out of your budget because they have the most people, and people are always the things typically that cost the most money. And so you have a right to know how that organization is set up. Now, I know everybody doesn't have the time to go through a 10 or 12 or 13-week Citizens Police Academy class once a week, but at least go to your police department's website. Most agencies have to do a racial not most, every agency in Texas, if they make traffic stops, they have to do a racial profiling report. Pull your agency's report and read it. Most agencies are going to do an annual report. Pull their annual report and read it. See the ratio of African American and Hispanic officers and white officers. They'll talk about their statistics in there. And so know those things about your department, how they're spending your money, your taxpayer money, and if there are things that you are dissatisfied with, make sure you let them know. And then the other point too is in these municipal elections, I live in Plano. We had elections for mayor, and our city is over 270,000 people. We had less than 8,000 people that come out to vote. And so if people aren't even paying attention to that, you know they don't. And I know some people say, well, maybe they're satisfied with their elected officials and the police. But get involved with your local government and know what's going on so that when things happen, you at least know more about what you're talking about instead of, again, things we get off of Twitter, and there's a lot of misinformation. You know how the system works, you know who works for who, you know how all how the layers are piled on, and it can make you more informed on how to deal with problems that do come up.
So we've heard a lot from the police. So here's some areas that we want to do to sort of engage with the community. What are some things the community can do to sort of take some steps towards law enforcement?
Well, I want to say one thing just quickly as an advertisement. Chief Drain mentioned the Citizens Police Academy. Great way to learn about your police department. I think ours is a 14-week process. You meet once a week. If that's available, certainly avail yourself of that. You'll learn how the police department works, but you also meet a lot of officers. You get to talk to them. You get to know who they are and what they're all about. Hugely successful program. So I would encourage any of you folks contact us and be a part of that.
I think one of the
he put his commercial in, obviously, I have to put my commercial in. Ours is 13 weeks long, and great program. We get rave reviews from it. You can go on our website now. Our next one is in February, and you're welcome to sign up. Other programs that we have too for young folks, the Youth Police Academy. I don't know if McKinney has that.
Yes.
And then we also have a Police Explorer program. And again, those are time-consuming and long programs, and I know that everybody can't do that, but still there are ways that you can find out about how your police department operates, how they function, so that you know more about it.
I would say that the community leaders, you know, in the same way that our officer leadership representation has said that there's going to be times where they get it wrong. I think the community has to acknowledge that there's going to be times when we're going to get it wrong, when we've called a wolf. We've called a sheep a wolf, you know, or we've mislabeled a situation. I would like, you know, I have children, and when my kids come to me and continually say, you know, they have a humongous issue and it's not really that big an issue by the time I get there, then by the time they tell me they have a humongous issue and it's actually there, I don't treat it correctly. And I would say that if we want to work well with the law enforcement, I think we need to be more sure. We need to think more about our accusations before we make the accusation, because when the accusation is true, if we continue to miss, it's racism, or it's this or it's that, and we continue to miss, then we just sound like a whiny person when the actual situation happens. So I think that we need to be slower to accuse, and to the community leaders. You know, these are and by community leaders, I'm talking about the barbershop, the barbers in the barbershops, and the people who court conversation. We've got to help people look beyond their emotional response. And their emotional response may be the right thing, but we got to help them go beyond that to be able to have a conversation with law enforcement where action can actually happen. Otherwise, you'll just come up as someone who's always complaining about the same thing, even though that issue is not actually. So
now a lot of people will believe that there's an issue. So we've heard about all these different things again, and accusation is one of them. What else can the community do? I mean, what else, Alonzo? What else can the community do to repair this relationship?
It's very, very simple. And I need the audience to be honest this evening. How many of you are registered to vote? Please raise your hand. How many of you actually vote? Please raise your hand. Whoa, yeah, that's pretty much right. For those on the outside, I'm sure you have family members, loved ones, and everyone else that don't bother to register to vote, that will not go out and vote, because the numbers are about the same as what you mentioned here, Chief Drain, in the city of McKinney. We can go knock on door to door and tell them, I'll get you a hamburger or whatever if you come out and vote, and they still won't do it. Here's the problem.
People just don't do stuff anyway. Right. That's just the way it is.
Real simple. Do you know who hires the police officers? The chiefs. Do you know who hires the chief? Your city manager. Do you know who hires the city manager? Your mayor and council. So therefore, if you do not vote, that's the first thing I ask people now, because I used to run all over the place to try to help people. I ask them, do you vote? Are you registered to vote? If not, I can't help you. That's where the problem starts. That is the number one issue that we are facing, because we have different groups that say, well, I don't believe in voting, I don't believe in the system. That may be the case on a national level, because you have your electoral college and all that, and I don't want to get into that this evening. That's another forum for another time. But on your local level, they make the decisions that deal with your day-to-day operations. So if something is going on within the police department and you're not registered to vote, we have a council member here, and I won't point her out unless she chooses to be pointed out. But I've been in some of those meetings, and the first thing they ask is this person registered to vote? Before they even hear your issues. So that's a problem in our community. That's easily rectifiable. We're in early voting starting now. There are no lines, absolutely no lines. You can get in and out. So I see on social media we talk about Empire and what's the other one, Scandal, but I don't see anyone promoting going out to vote, taking pictures, grab someone, are you registered to vote? Let's go vote. So that is the number one issue that is plaguing the community, something that and I told you I was going to offend some people out here this evening, everyone. So if I haven't offended you yet, just raise your hand and let me know, and I'll probably say something later that will offend you. So, and I got to touch on this, and then I'll be done. You mentioned something about systemic, and you mentioned, I said about the hoses and the dogs. Now, that's a method. What I'm mentioning is the system itself. The methods change within the system, but the system is still there. So when you have that mentality of an officer, I'm going into the hood. And there are buzzwords that I'm going to give the officers, because I'm going to help you all out, because this is about bridging the gap. When you hear the elders in the community say, that baby didn't do anything, please listen. Now, if the elders in the community go in their house and don't say anything, that's a chance that Johnny over there did do something and he is a criminal. So I've seen that firsthand, and I've also seen the delay in the response time in the East Side community. I've had to literally go get in my car, go get the officers at the old courthouse that they tore down, parking lot, and say, hey, did you not get that call 45 minutes ago? So when the officer gets there, yeah, they say, well, the suspect or suspects are no longer in the vicinity. Yeah, because it took you 45 minutes to get there. So these are issues that are real and have to be addressed. And I'm going to slide my soapbox right back over here.
That's a nice soapbox. We're running low on time, so I'd love to get more into that systemic issue, because I think there's a lot there that I hear in the media, that I read, and those kinds of things. We're not getting into all that piece. But one of the things as I look at the reconciliation, there are kind of three layers that I always kind of look at to how do you get to reconciliation. One is recognition of something that has happened, a confession of the wrong that's been done, and then there's repentance to say, I'm gonna turn away and not do that again. As I think about the relationship between the community and the police, and McKinney is a great city, right? I know we have the pool scenario that happened, but we see the outbreak from that is not like what you've seen in other parts of the country. But I don't want to say that to sort of imply that there's no problem, that there's no issue underneath all of that. But I still think that from a national standpoint, there seems to be some lines being drawn. There's some feelings hurt. There's some people who feel devalued on both sides, right? Like, I would imagine, especially when I see these officers getting shot, like executed, like down in Harris County, like that really drew in. I know that the police department really drew in, and there was a lot of, all not just Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, Cops Matter, all that stuff. People started drawing lines, and feelings were hurt. So what I'm curious about on both sides, right, and we'll kind of split this. We'll put the officers on this side and everybody else on that side for just a second, and say, how can you actually speak to the hurt that exists between cops are hurt and the community's hurt? So from a community standpoint, how can the cops speak to the hurt that is exhibited in the community?
Well, I can honestly say, and I'm not saying here because he's on the panel, but Chief Conley did that when he addressed the pool issue, and the mayor did as well, that when the community is able to see the human side of the police department, of our city officials, and when an action takes place, same thing you mentioned before, Chief Drain, I have, criminals in my family as well, and I'm not going to sit here and pat them on the back and say that they need, a pardon for the things that they've done. So by the same token, but when you are able to say one of our own was wrong, that's where the healing can begin, because it's not just you hiding behind the shield like the NFL does and say, protect the shield at all costs. To see the human side, because we understand that every time you get a call, we want to make sure that that officer goes home, but I also want to make sure that I go home too. I have a family that loves me as well. So we understand that every time first responders get a call, they don't know what they're going into. They're going based upon what dispatch is telling them. So you really don't know who's who. I have a perspective of that, having served in the military. When you're going into an environment, you don't know if it's hostile or not. So you're trying to make sure that everyone, for the most part, most cops, I will say that, I'm not going to throw all cops because there are bad seeds, but for the most part, most cops are saying, hey, we want to make sure that everyone gets home safely, that criminal element is removed from that environment, that people are able to live in peace. And one of the things that the city council has on their board, it talks about the quality of life. So that's where the healing can begin, is understanding that behind that shield, behind that blue uniform, there is also a human being that has issues, that has families, that has debt and dealing with high gas prices and everything else, just like the rest of us. So that's where it starts.
That's great. Anything to add to that community side over there?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything that Alonzo said. I think that owning up to your stuff goes a long way to healing any relationship, as you mentioned, with repentance. I also think that from the community, that these programs that allow the community to see that the police is actually for them. I think we've heard, sort of without it being said, we've heard that the community kind of feels like the police is against them on so many levels. That's the narrative that needs to change. We can do these one-offs with these conversations, and they're great, but we can follow it up with something that will communicate that, we are for you, we're here to protect you. And I believe that's the difference between the West Side and the East Side citizen situation. One of them feels like trust the police and the other one does not. So I think in building that trust, we have to believe that the police is actually on our side, or that the community, you're actually here to help me. And that's going to take a little bit of, that's going to take a lot from the police side to come over and bridge the gap there. And it's also going to take the receptivity of a community to say, you know what, maybe it's not all race or racism or the things I think. Let me give these guys a shot. And I think somewhere between the two of those, we can make some real progress.
Great. Now, so from your perspective, and I know you guys are I mean, you guys are strong guys, big burly guys. I know people's feelings don't get hurt, but I know some guys who are in the police, and it's been a tough road.
Well, I think certainly from both sides, we have this narrative playing out nationally,
Right.
and we can't say that we're all affected by it,
Yeah.
whether you live in the community, whether you work on the police force. I will tell you, from the McKinney community, there's been a tremendous outpouring of support for the police officers. They feel that, they experience that. Now, can I say that's throughout the whole community? I don't know. I can't say for sure. We hear it in all segments of the community, but I don't want to generalize that and say, well, this is coming from everyone. We need to continue to build those relationships and continue to work on that. From the police perspective, though, it's a tough job. Yeah. We need to feel empathy for one another. I want my officers to be able to empathize with the folks they work with, the citizens they come up to, everyone they deal with. They need to have empathy for them. It doesn't mean they don't have to protect themselves. It doesn't mean they don't have to arrest the bad guys. They've got to do their job. They've got to keep the community safe. But we need to humanize all our transactions. In the same way I want my officers to have empathy for the folks they work for, I want the community to feel that too. Try to put yourself in that officer's shoes. What if that was you having to go into that very difficult situation, a very, very scary situation? Officers are human. And that's why I talk about humanizing this whole job. It's not like it is on TV. We live in this TV culture, this video culture, and Alonzo knows a lot of movies and a lot of analogies from it, and they do speak to our culture, but certainly policing doesn't work like that. Most of us aren't superheroes. We don't have superpowers. We're just human beings. I can't, take you down with, one punch or the look. I mean, I'm just human, and that's true for most of us. And so I think when we get that kind of empathy going on between the community, between the officers, that'll go a long way to healing.
Any practical, for the audience, any practical expressions of that you've experienced that we can emulate?
Yeah, I think one thing, it is helpful when, I can't tell you how many people come up to us and say, hey, I appreciate your service, officer. I really appreciate what you do, and we support you. And really, I would say if you're from the minority community, just go up and tell the officers that. It's going to go a long way, and you don't know how you're going to make that person feel or the next interaction with the police, how that might affect that officer, what his perspective might change just because you did that. So you're going a long way to help your community also when you do that. So I would say those things help.
Anything for you, Assistant Chief, in that?
Yes, I think like McKinney, our citizens in Plano, and again, I can't speak for all 270,000 citizens, but the majority of the comments we get from citizens have been positive, and there are certainly an element of people that don't like the police, but we haven't had a big issue with that. Some tangible evidence of that, even with the African American community, is we do an MLK parade every year. This most recent one, they asked my chief, Chief Rushing, and I to come up, and that committee, obviously an African American group, presented us with an award at City Hall. We've had African American churches that have asked, both me and the chief, MOCOP, Mount Olive Church and others to come and speak just to let us know in front of their congregation that they appreciate what we do. So there have been tangible signs that our community supports us there in Plano, even our African American community. But I make no claims that you're not going to find detractors. In some cases, people maybe have a right to have some skepticism about the police too.
I think those are healthy ways to kind of look at that, and that's kind of what we wanted to talk about, is to see the human aspect. I think that there's a tendency for people to sort of demonize an entire group by aspects of small portions of others, and some would say that happens in the African American community, and some would say that happens in the police community, and being able to see people as human beings is a key piece. I want to close with just kind of stressing this point that you guys have kind of closed with. And Chief Conley, you heard me share this, the kind of the day everything happened with my son after the McKinney Pool incident. I'm rushing home to go meet with the chief and several pastors to kind of talk through this whole thing. And my son had somehow, just because my parents were not watching, had seen this McKinney Pool issue. And he came down and he was crying. As I was getting kind of dinner, getting ready to go out the door, and I said, well, what are you crying for? And he said, and he pointed over the TV because the news was playing it, and he said, I'm afraid. I said, what are you afraid of? I'm afraid of the police. And I was hurt in that moment by that, because he's 7 years old, and here now starts this sort of new thing. And I leaned down and I said, look, son, not all police officers are bad. Some make bad choices because they're human, and that's what we do. But I'm about to go, and I'm going to meet with the boss of this police officer tonight, and I'm going to prove to you he's a good guy. And I shared that with Chief Conley, and then that night I got Chief to take a picture with me, very happy picture, man in uniform. I'm shaking his hand, and that next morning my son came downstairs, and he's like, well, how did it go? And I showed him a picture, and he immediately felt better. And I was able to remind him that these guys are humans just like everybody else. He's got his arm around his dad. I reminded him of police officers that we knew. And I think that point of relationships, building relationships with each other so that you can see that person in that group as not just a member of that group, but it has a name, it has a face, and it has an emotional reaction to it. So I appreciate the conversation tonight. I appreciate everyone who was able to submit in, and I tried to grab certain pieces of several questions and bring them together to throw them out. If you can give our panel a round of applause for taking advantage of that. Thank you for the round of applause up top. Love that. I'd like to thank again First Baptist Church for allowing us to come in and be in this beautiful facility. I thank Elevate for making this night happen. All right, Holla. I'd like to thank the Chief of Police, the Assistant Chief, all of our panel, and the City of McKinney, City of Plano, and all of you guys for taking your time out tonight. We recognize that this type of conversation does not fix everything, but we hope that this has been able to kind of get something started in our hearts and minds and stir us towards some conclusions and some ways to sort of approach this in the future. Thank you very much. Good night. Have a great and blessed evening.